Real excited to be here today, everybody, and just real grateful that y'all have all made the time to be here. My name is Eric Tupin. I'm a senior developer at Atten Design Group, and I've been working at Atten for a super long time. I think a little more than 15 years now. I'm also the lead developer for Solo and SSF. That's Stanford on and off campus learning opportunities and Stanford seed funding. And I have been since their inception. We've been partnered with Stanford's Research, Information Technology, and Innovation team, that's REITI, since way back in 2015 when these projects began. So today is the third installment of a three-part series about options moving on from your Drupal 7 website. Jennifer Dust gave a great talk on WordPress as an option a little while back. You can find that on our webinars page on our website. And James Nedick and Jordan Graham gave a great talk about Drupal 9, the traditional move from Drupal 7, also available, of course, on our website. And then today, I'll be talking about Backdrop. So today's whole presentation is going to be about upgrading your Drupal 7 website to Backdrop CMS. And I'm going to use a recent upgrade project of ours, the websites that I mentioned a moment ago, as a case study to demonstrate. This is Stanford on and off campus learning opportunities. It's one of the websites that we're going to be talking about today. And this one is Stanford Seed Funding, which is the other site that myself and Joel Steidel, who's the director of engineering here at Atten, recently converted from Drupal 7 to Backdrop CMS. You can check out these sites at solo.stanford.edu and seedfunding.stanford.edu, both spelled how they sound. Both of these sites focus on evaluating applications, and they make use of some pretty complicated workflows in order to do that. I'm going to talk about that in a lot more detail in just a little bit here. So we're going to talk about a couple of things today. We'll start with what is Backdrop and why you might use it. We'll then talk about whether Backdrop CMS is right for you and your organization. Then chat a little bit about these two websites that I just mentioned. And then we'll compare a little bit the differences between Drupal 7, Drupal 9, and Backdrop CMS. And finally, talk about the outcome of our move to Backdrop for these two sites and how that kind of looks for us now. So before I dive into that outline, I want to talk a little bit about what I'll call the end of the Drupal 7 world. So Drupal 7 is very interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that it represents more than a decade of conceptual continuity, meaning that for more than 10 years, people have been building websites in Drupal 7. They have been creating all kinds of documentation, whether that's on blogs, official documentation, Stack Overflow, thousands of modules, tons of themes, just tons of different ways to work with Drupal 7. So that it's probably no surprise that even today, more than 500,000 websites still use Drupal 7. Now, you can check out that number at drupal.org/project/usage/Drupal. And that actually fluctuates a little bit day to day. And I think most recently is reading somewhere around 450,000 people still on Drupal 7. So Drupal 7 end of life is imminent, sort of, in that it already kind of happened, was extended, and may get extended again. What exactly is end of life? Probably a lot of people in this room are familiar with the term. If you're not, that basically just means that security support ends for Drupal 7. So there's no team looking for and fixing security problems. Now, that doesn't mean that your Drupal 7 website will turn into a pumpkin in November of next year, which is the end of life as of today. But it does mean that after that date, your site is likely to get less and less secure, perhaps less and less performant over time. If you do have issues, it's going to be harder for you to find support to get those things fixed. And of course, with security, after a couple of months in that direction, it's really time to start thinking about a permanent solution, perhaps a lot sooner, depending on your particular circumstance. So the traditional upgrade path from Drupal 7, I think is pretty obvious, would be to the newer versions of Drupal, right? So to Drupal 8, 9, and 10, and today that would be Drupal 9. Upgrading to Drupal 9 is not really a true upgrade, it's a rebuild. And of course has all of those associated costs. And when we talk about a rebuild, it means completely rebuilding your site from the ground up on the back end and the front end. Virtually no files from your old site will be usable on the new site. So one question to think about during the course of this presentation is that truly feasible? And I think that for a lot of people, it is. I think that some folks have put aside resources, have planned time, and are prepared to do an upgrade or rebuild to Drupal 9. But then also, is it desirable? And even if you do have those resources allocated, if there is another option that is far more economic, is it worth considering? So now we can hop back into this outline. And we'll start with what is Backdrop and why would you use it? So kind of a spoiler here, if it's not already obvious, I am going to be positioning Backdrop CMS in this presentation as an economic option for your Drupal 7 upgrade. If you leave this presentation right now, if you stop paying attention right now, if you only remember one thing, that should be the following. You could spend a small fraction of your estimated rebuild cost on upgrading to Backdrop CMS from Drupal 7. Backdrop is not particularly new. It was first released back in 2015. And since then, there have been secure, viable, and innovative releases that are committed to a direct upgrade path from Drupal 7. So a little more specific about that, when I say viable, all I mean is that if you have a Drupal 7 website, it's going to work on Backdrop CMS. There's really no question about that. We would need to take a look to see what the level of complexity is, but it absolutely will work. When we say secure, I just mean by that Backdrop CMS has, since its inception, had a dedicated security team, just like Drupal does. And so it's going to be absolutely secure for whatever needs you might have. And innovative, I mean by that Backdrop CMS is not just kind of a newer or functioning version of Drupal 7. They've actually completely revamped some kind of large pieces of the software ecosystem. Some quick examples of that: configuration and code has been completely rebuilt. That's similar to the way that Drupal 8 and Drupal 9 work, but not exactly the same. The caching system has been completely revamped. Backdrop CMS is actually about 30% faster out of the box on a fresh install compared to Drupal 7. Also, there is a completely new layer for layout building that has been attached to Backdrop CMS. Gives you quite a few really cool options for building custom layouts and custom themes. Backdrop CMS is a fork of the Drupal 7 codebase. So if you're not a developer, what that means basically is that modern Drupal and modern Backdrop CMS have a common ancestor. So 7 years ago, when work started on Backdrop CMS, it was built by creating a copy of Drupal 7. And then that copy has since then developed on its own into its own software. Backdrop CMS is built primarily for architects, then contributors, then core contributors. I'm going to explain that real quick. And also, the rest of this particular slide is just kind of cherry-picked from backdropcms.org/philosophy. If you have a moment, you should definitely check that out. That will cover this and some more. When we talk about built for architects, Backdrop is not designed to be like the next best thing for developers. Quite the contrary, it's designed to be the best thing for builders, for folks who are creating websites, using the user interface, clicking through things, installing modules, and kind of putting things together. Next priority on their list are contributors. And that would be folks like myself who do write some code, do write some modules or some conversions, and contribute to the code base. And then finally, the last priority is core contributors, which would be the folks who are building and maintaining core modules to keep the lights on, to keep the software working. Backdrop is a pretty small community. I think that's very much worth pointing out early on in this conversation. So if you think about, let's say, WordPress as kind of a huge world community of software developers, and then think of Drupal compared to that, it'd be kind of a small dot compared to a massive blob. And then if you think of Backdrop compared to Drupal, it's going to be really similar, kind of a small dot compared to a much bigger blob. That said, that can be a little bit misleading because WordPress developers are not Drupal developers, and Drupal developers are not WordPress developers. But Backdrop developers are by default Drupal developers because the API, the actual coding language, is so similar. So a lot of that community is actually shared with Drupal. Backdrop is currently supported in its current version, Backdrop 1, through at least 2025. And beyond that would be the introduction of Backdrop 2, which the plan there is a seamless upgrade, a point-and-click upgrade from Backdrop 1 to Backdrop 2. So there's a quick overview of what Backdrop is and why you might use it. So let's talk about whether Backdrop CMS could work for you and your organization. I kind of think of this slide as a funnel, right? So we're starting kind of wide at the top, going down narrow to the bottom in terms of qualifying whether you're a good fit for Backdrop. So the most obvious thing to start at the very beginning, if you're on a Drupal 7 website today, you should be considering Backdrop CMS. It is a good option, at least. If you don't have an existing and funded action plan for your move to Drupal 9 or to some other platform, then I would say that Backdrop is an excellent candidate for your Drupal 7 website. Now, the next two kind of go together, and these are really pivotal. If you like your existing website, if you like the way things are working, if you're 80, 90% more satisfied with your current platform, and if you're kind of frustrated by the whole end-of-life issue that you have to upgrade your website, I would say that makes Backdrop CMS a perfect candidate for your next move. And then finally, if your development team, whether that's internal partners, vendors, if they're excited about building on Backdrop, well, then you should just basically get started there. A couple other ways to think about moving to Backdrop and whether this is a great fit for you. So I personally feel like Backdrop CMS is a good fit for anybody on Drupal 7, especially according to that prior slide. So if you're happy with your current platform, I think it's a great solution. However, there's some further ways we can think about this. So if you think about websites as either really simple on the one hand or really complicated on the other, let's talk about how Backdrop could work for two ends of that spectrum. So we start with simple websites. If you have a simple Drupal 7 website that is primarily built with core modules or popular contributed modules, if you don't have a development team, or you have a small development team, or maybe it's just you, well, then you can expect a fast upgrade to Backdrop CMS with little or no actual development, like writing code. Something I want to point out real quick here is that the theme upgrading a theme from Drupal 7 to Backdrop is always technical. You do have to write code. If you have a custom theme and you're married to it, you'll absolutely need to upgrade that with a developer. On the other hand, if you've chosen an out-of-the-box theme and you're willing to choose another one or the same one that's been converted to Backdrop, then you're back in that kind of no-code zone where you can upgrade just by point and click. So on the other end, the far end of this gradients is very complicated websites. So these would be Drupal 7 websites that are highly customized, have a lot of custom code, custom modules, complicated contrib module configurations, absolutely a custom theme. We're definitely talking about a custom theme at this level. These upgrades are going to be far slower than that first process that I mentioned. It's no longer a point and click upgrade. It's likely that you might have to actually convert some modules that are not yet available in Backdrop CMS. Now that's getting less likely as time goes by, just because so many modules are now available for Backdrop CMS. but there's still a possibility there. If you convert contributed modules, if you have custom modules you have to convert, if you have themes you have to convert, or a theme, you can definitely expect that it's going to be technical, there's going to be code refactoring, and there's going to be a significant learning curve to get adjusted to some of the changes in Backdrop compared to Drupal. Now, this is likely to include days, weeks, or even more of really intense, focused debugging work. Now, all of that said, the resources invested will still be dramatically less than those it would take to rebuild your site in a new platform, like whether it's Drupal 9 or any other content management system. So finished up with whether Backdrop might work for you. And now I'd like to move into this case study. So let me kind of qualify this real quick. What I'm mostly trying to demonstrate with this next section is on that complex end of the gradient that we just talked about, just how complicated can your Drupal 7 website be and still have a successful move to Backdrop CMS? That's kind of the question that we're about to try to answer. And I think that the brief answer is extremely complicated. So we're going to use this case study with Solo and SSF to talk about some of the complexities of these platforms. If you go to these websites, and again, that was solo.stanford.edu and seedfunding.stanford.edu, you can see some stuff, you can see some content, but if you're not a Stanford user, you can't do much more. And so what I'm going to do is show a couple of slides that demonstrate the back end of this site, which is kind of creating content and the whole workflow management process to give you a sense of the complexity of these platforms. I'm going to do this in a moment here by auto-playing a couple of these slides while I kind of talk through some of the features of the website, if I can figure out how to do that with my current screen sharing setup. The screens that I'm about to walk through, so this one, I guess you can see on the slide there, this is Stanford on and off campus learning opportunities. I'm not going to show today the other site, Stanford Seed Funding. They're pretty similar, but aimed at totally different audiences and have different feature sets. But just for time's sake, we'll just go through the one. The screens I'm about to walk through are a specific user type called a program officer, who is creating an opportunity, which would be an educational opportunity, and then creating a custom application form for that opportunity. And then we'll show some screens that focus on managing applications that are submitted to that opportunity and some of the processes about the rest of the workflow. This is really select. It's just a few of these pieces, but it should give you a solid idea of these how these platforms work. So autoplay, let's see if we can figure it out. I'm going to try every 10 seconds a slide and see if that works for me. Okay, so the first thing, perhaps the most important thing to share about these platforms is that they represent 7 years of ongoing development work. We have been releasing new features almost every month for 7 whole years. These platforms facilitate complex application workflow management that were developed specifically for Stanford faculty, Stanford staff, and Stanford students. They are highly customized platforms. We use more than 60 contributed modules, all with, of course, custom configurations, nearly 40 custom modules. There are 2 custom API integrations. So one is with the Stanford Profiles platform that brings over faculty data to automatically attach to their applications for research funding. And the other integration is with middleware and integration services, that's MAIS, that brings over student records and student information to attach to their applications for educational opportunities. These platforms, like all of Stanford's platforms, use single sign-on and implement Stanford's SUNET process to do that. There's some interesting functionality there. SUNET brings over some information about users, like who they are, what work groups they're related to, and that lets us customize their experience from the get-go. So when you sign in, we know you're an applicant, or we know you're a program officer or reviewer or whatever else. These platforms also include some really robust and complex on-the-fly PDF rendering. So as program officers are creating these custom application forms, and then applicants are filling them out, they fill out these forms, they attach some other files, maybe they have some PDFs or some spreadsheets, some text documents to attach. And all of that stuff gets packaged into one well-structured and clear PDF that can be anywhere from 2 to 50 pages long, which represents their full application. And those can be sent off to third-party reviewers to be reviewed by custom review rubrics. There are automated download managers that manage all of this functionality, allowing program officers to send packages of a handful or dozens or even hundreds of applications off to be reviewed by third parties. These platforms implement a little more than 5 user roles, but it's actually 5 are the primary user roles. So we have program officers who create these opportunities. We have applicants who apply for them. We have recommenders who can leave letters of recommendation or other recommendation assets for applications or for applicants. We have reviewers who are third-party reviewers that can then score these applications and return those scores to program officers. And then we have student program officers, which is program officers can actually recruit Stanford students onto their team and use them to help manage all of their hundreds of applications with more limited permissions and limited functionality. Let me pause this real quick. Let's see. There we go. Just a couple more pieces of information about this platform before we move on. There's also a completely customizable notifications system, which is dozens of designed HTML emails that are automatically triggered at various pieces of the workflow. So things like your application is due in a week. Your application was due last week. A recommendation has been submitted. Someone has submitted to your opportunity, all kinds of different things that just kind of push this workflow along and move applications from that just getting started stage all the way through to getting reviewed. These two platforms see about 18,000 Stanford users. Now, these are only for Stanford users, so that's a little bit different than like a regular public website. Since their inception, we have created more than 1,000 opportunities for educational experiences all over the world and research funding at Stanford. Monthly, we get as many as 20,000 visits and serve as many as 275,000 pages. And again, all to Stanford users. So the reason that I went through all that, just to kind of repeat myself here, is to really make it clear the complexity of site that we're talking about when we talk about moving to Backdrop. So while this is a great solution for your blog site, for your brochure site, that's really not what we're focused on today. We're talking about really complicated technology and moving that to Backdrop CMS. So let's talk about some of the differences between Drupal 7, Drupal 9, and Backdrop, and specifically some things to think about if you're considering staying on 7, moving to 9, or maybe moving to Backdrop. So if you stay on Drupal 7, you have core support until November of next year, probably, and it may get extended again. We don't really know how that's going to work. There's really great contrib support, meaning that all of the contributed modules and core modules are all well supported, but you can expect that to slow down. It's already slowed down considerably. And the reason is any Drupal developer who's made a Drupal 7 module is going to be far more focused on the modern versions of that, their Drupal 9 or Drupal 10 versions. And so if you log an issue with the Drupal 7 version, that's not going to be anybody's top priority. So you can kind of expect support to dwindle. There's also wide industry support for Drupal 7, meaning that it's very easy to find developers to work on it. Tons of people have Drupal 7 experience. But of course, anybody you work with on a Drupal 7 site, one of their first questions is going to be, great, what's your plan? How are we getting off of this? There's also a bit of a high risk of PHP compatibility. So PHP 8 compatibility. Something I didn't mention earlier. So PHP 7.4, which is the PHP version that Drupal's built on, is actually end-of-lifing, I believe, later this month. Now, that doesn't create a huge problem for Drupal 7 core, because I believe that core can work with PHP 8 or will be able to by then. However, contributed modules, custom themes, any custom code that you have could be problematic with PHP 8. And PHP 7 is going to be getting less and less secure as time goes on, just after this month of this year. Okay, so the outlook of Drupal 7, I think it's pretty obvious. Drupal 7 moves to Drupal 8, 9, and 10. And there's plenty of stability in that outlook. So if you're staying on Drupal 7, the benefit of this is pretty clear. And that's just that you don't have to do anything. You don't have to pay any money. You don't have to build anything. You don't even have to, well, you might have to worry a little bit, but you don't have to worry a lot for at least a few months and maybe even a full year if we are lucky. Okay, and then let's say that you were to move to Drupal 9. So what are some benefits here? Drupal 9, obviously, excellent support, long-term support, and a well-defined roadmap to future versions. There is a lot of stability in moving to Drupal 9. There's also really wide industry support and innovative support. So what I mean by that is because there are so many Drupal 9 developers, tons of new modules are getting created, tons of new themes are getting created, new extensions, all kinds of unrelated digital services like hosting are providing out-of-the-box solutions for Drupal 9, like click this button to install your Drupal 9 site, just tons of support kind of across the domain. Drupal 9 is also feature-rich out of the box. So as soon as you install it, you can install tons of different themes and start playing with those, hundreds of different modules, thousands of different modules, whatever you want. Tons of stuff to play with as soon as you get it installed. And the outlook for Drupal 9 is actually really great. So not only is there all that stability baked in that we just talked about with Drupal, but also once you've made the very difficult leap from Drupal 7 into Drupal 9, you don't have to worry. The next move to Drupal 10 is nothing like that. It's a simple move compared to a really complicated rebuild. Okay, so then, the thing to consider here is that if you're moving to Drupal 9, you must completely rebuild your website from beginning to end. That's the back end, it's the theme layer, absolutely everything must be completely rebuilt. And that's gonna at least be the cost of your original website build, probably significantly more, just because things tend to get more expensive as time goes on, and you probably have some new features that you wanna kind of wrap into there. And then finally, what it might look like to move to Backdrop CMS. So Backdrop CMS also has long-term support and a very well-defined roadmap to future versions. As I mentioned before, Backdrop 1 is currently supported and will be until at least 2025. And the plan right now is for Backdrop 2 to be introduced sometime after that with a click-to-upgrade process. I mentioned before that Backdrop CMS has a much smaller community than Drupal. And there's a couple of nuances here that are kind of interesting. So one thing that you might talk about with smaller communities, industry support, like how hard is it to find developers? And you might think with a smaller community, it's harder to find developers. And I would challenge that a little bit. If you were to post an ad for Backdrop developers, you get less responses than an ad for Drupal developers, because there are so many more people that kind of self-identify as Drupal developers. But as I mentioned earlier in this webinar, anybody who's worked in Drupal can work in Backdrop. And so the pool of developers is actually quite large. There is some things to think about in terms of innovation. So, with hundreds of thousands of developers in Drupal 9, new modules, new themes are coming out all the time. Whereas in Backdrop CMS, with far, far fewer committed developers, modules are not being released all the time. Themes are not being released all the time. And so if you're really counting on like, hey, I want to check out all the new modules, I want to check out all the new themes, that innovation is far slower on the Backdrop side. What does this mean for you and your team? If you have a developer on board or will be working with a vendor, it doesn't mean a whole lot. Any functionality that you want to build can absolutely be built in Backdrop. But if you don't have a development team, if you're going to be, as a non-developer, installing and configuring modules yourself, there's a much smaller pool to choose from, and that may be a little bit more difficult. So the upshot here with upgrading to Backdrop CMS is that it is extremely cost-effective, which I will talk about more in a moment here, and very low risk. What I specifically mean by very low risk is that if you rebuild in Drupal 9 or another content management system, you need to completely and thoroughly document every single piece of your website that needs to work in the new platform, because you're going to need to rebuild it from the ground up. In Backdrop, because it is backwards compatible with Drupal 7, all of the code that you've spent years writing will by default work in Backdrop, at least to some 85, 95%. You might need a developer to touch up a few things, but by default, all the features you've been building are just going to work. So you don't even need to necessarily document all the things that you need to rebuild, because there is no rebuild. They should all just port by default. I think I skipped something. There we go. So let's talk about the outcome for the two websites that I have been talking about throughout this presentation. One note that I want to make before I get too far into this, we were grappling with this decision in the fall of last year. And that was actually before the first Drupal 7 end-of-life extension announcement, which means that we felt some considerable pressure to make a move, whether it was going to be to Drupal 9 or Backdrop or something else. That pressure may have been eased a little bit compared to today, but I still think that it was absolutely the right decision then, and still is an excellent decision now to move to Backdrop CMS. So a couple of quick reminders, again, just about complexity of these platforms. They include 7 or 8 distinct phases of application management. That's 7 on one platform and 8 on the other, if that matters. Dozens of feature sets like automated PDF generation, like automated downloads, customizable notifications, all kinds of different user experience pieces. A little more detail about complexity here. We have to use automated tests to test these platforms because there are so many features. And those automated tests on a local machine, what that does is it uses a regular browser and loads up the website and goes through each one of the pages, filling out forms, submitting stuff, and going through that whole workflow. Those automated tests that only cover about 85% of our features, running lightning fast, where every page load is like a fraction of a second on a local machine, still takes a half an hour, more than a half an hour to run all of our tests. It's 1,200 plus tests. So when we first were considering what to do with these platforms, we of course thought of Drupal 9. If you don't know much about Atom Design, we do tons of Drupal 9 work. That's most of our new website builds would be in Drupal 9. A conservative estimate of rebuilding these two platforms in Drupal 9 was between 3,500 and 4,000 hours. And again, based on plenty of experience with the platform. Okay, so after we actually decided to go with Backdrop CMS, let's talk a little bit about that. First of all, I mentioned some of this earlier in this talk, but there were some really difficult moments. I do not want to paint a picture where Backdrop CMS is just this like cakewalk into a new system. It could be a cakewalk if you have a blog site or a very simple kind of non-developer site. But if you have complex technology, it's gonna be a thing. There were plenty of difficult moments. We were using 61 contributed modules. Of those, 17 were not yet available in Backdrop. Now, this is about a year ago, so things have changed a little bit, 8 months ago. But we had to convert 17 of those modules. We had to convert all of our custom modules, which was 38 custom modules. Also did a complete overhaul of some of the old systems we were using to run things. Kind of a goofy example here, if you're familiar with Drupal 7, is context. We were using context to do all kinds of logic about what gets placed on the page in Drupal 7. And that kind of went away in Backdrop, and so we had to rethink how to do that. We also had to completely convert our theme. A little caveat there is that we did what I would call like an economic approach to theme conversion, which is that we didn't convert into Backdrop's native kind of layout builder functionality. So that was a little bit less time consuming than it could have been. But all of this done, converting contrib modules, all of our custom modules, complete overhauls, the whole theme rebuilt. In addition to that, a couple hundred different changes that I documented in our code base as we were going along there. But all of those things together, the upgrade process still took us just 550 hours. That's compared to, again, 3,500 or 4,000 in a rebuild. Those 550 hours we did over 3 months. It was actually a pretty comfortable pace. And that represents less than 15% of the estimated rebuild cost, which is a huge win in my book. Actually, inside of those 550 hours, we managed to do quite a few other things that are not specifically Backdrop related. So for instance, we decided to move these platforms from a legacy hosting provider to Pantheon.io, which is a really great, very fast hosting provider. But they require some specific tweaks to the code. There's a specific upstream that Drupal sites have to run on. So we had to adapt the code base to work with Pantheon. We also did our entire migration. So as I mentioned before, nearly 20,000 Stanford users, 2 production websites, full migration of those production websites over to Pantheon.io. All of that fit in that 550 hours. And all those tests that I mentioned, those 1,200 tests, they were originally written in this Selenium-based platform that we were using. And we switched all those to a little bit more modern platform, Cypress.js, which in itself was about a week of work. And that also was inside of this 550 hours. So just a huge difference between rebuilding and upgrading. So where we are today, Solo and seed funding are secure. They are supported and they are PHP 8 ready. Our sprint cycle, I mentioned that we have been releasing new features just about every month for about 7 years. And we were able to get back to that after just 3 calendar months. These platforms also perform about 50% better than they did before based on average page load. I think the responsibility there is shared between Backdrop CMS and Pantheon. Like I mentioned, Pantheon is really well tuned to serve pages super fast. And Backdrop CMS with a fresh install is about 30% faster than Drupal 7. The entire upgrade, our code refactor for Pantheon, migrating both platforms, rebuilding thousands of tests, all of that achieved for 15% of the estimated rebuild cost in Drupal 9. I'm going to finish this presentation by sharing with you a quote from Pauline Lamaru, who's the senior product manager for both of the sites that we were just talking about, Solo and seed funding. Senior product manager for Stanford Information Technology and Innovation Office. So she said about these projects, moving our Solo and seed funding platforms from Drupal 7 to Backdrop was a major and adventurous endeavor. Not only did we save the university time and money, but we also got some great performance boosts, a new testing suite, and many other benefits. It was such a pleasure to tackle this move with you and the team. I hope that by pioneering this solution in the higher education space, we've made it easier for others to follow a similar path and realize similar benefits.